Welcome to our webcast, Building Process Improvement Proficiency Through Blended Learning. I'm Ellen Milnes, Director of Marketing for moresteam.com, and will be the moderator for today's program, which is sponsored by Moresteam. A few words about our company. Moresteam is a global provider of online process improvement training and support tools, such as online simulations, data analysis, and project management. We've trained over 500,000 individuals and have served over half of the Fortune 500 companies. We partner with professional associations such as the American Society for Quality and the Project Management Institute, as well as leading universities who use our courses in their exec ed, graduate, and undergraduate programs within their business and engineering curriculums. We enjoy providing the opportunity for our clients and partners to showcase their work, along with showing insights from the work that we've done. Today's program is scheduled for 1 hour. During the program, you'll be able to pose questions by typing in the question block of the attendee control panel. Please enter your questions as they arise. We'll have a Q&A segment at the end of the presentation. A copy of today's materials, the recording, and Bill's slides will be posted to our webcast library on the Moresteam website for your reference and sharing. We'll email you a link when materials have been uploaded. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Bill Hathaway. Prior to founding Moresteam in 2000, Bill spent 13 years in manufacturing, quality, and operations management. After 10 years at Ford Motor Company, Bill then held executive-level operations positions with Raytheon, at Amana Home Appliances, and with Mansfield Plumbing Products. Bill is an alum of the University of Notre Dame and Northwestern University, having earned an undergraduate finance degree from Notre Dame and a graduate degree in business finance and operations from Northwestern's Kellogg Graduate School of Management. Bill, thank you for joining us today.
Good morning. We thought it would be useful today to spend a few minutes talking about some recent research that we've done in the arena of blended learning. As a firm, we've been involved with blended learning now for 15 years, and recently did a little research to try to understand more about what was working best for clients that are using blended learning models. So this is really about using Lean Six Sigma techniques to understand how we can best deliver Lean Six Sigma capability. It's all towards designing a better blended learning model by understanding at the root what components and approaches to the model work best. So this started out about a year ago. We first started collecting some data, survey data from live events that we hold around the country and also in Europe, and wanted to get a little more insight about practices and approaches, and also understand what was driving the design of various learning models among our client base. And then also we did a survey late last summer among our larger enterprise customers, those that are using a blended learning model. And this was about 30, I think we got responses from about 30 of our largest enterprise customers who are typically have pretty advanced, comprehensive blended learning approaches that they're using often on a global basis. So those respondents, would include IBM, HP, Hertz, AB InBev, Tyco. You can see the list there on the screen. So quite a few larger companies who have been taking a serious approach to process improvement for some time. So the first output that I want to share with you is a question that we asked of at our live events over the last year or so around training design and what the drivers are. So we asked, what's really pushing you in your model development? And I was a little surprised, frankly. It was encouraging, really, to see that training effectiveness was overwhelmingly the most significant driver. I really would have expected to see cost and particularly travel cost, as well as flexibility, show up as more prevalent drivers. But I think it's really encouraging to see that there's a value being placed on effectiveness, because ultimately, if it doesn't work, why do it? The next question was, what skills or tools are most important to you and your people? And this was also a really interesting result, in that you can see that the overwhelming response was skill at implementing change. So the soft skills of convincing someone who doesn't want to do something that they ought to do it, that they ought to change their approach, came out as the overwhelming favorite, and followed by lean methods, simple data analysis tools, team leadership, which is in some ways related to the first choice. And then last, bringing up the rear, is complex data analysis tools. So this is kind of interesting. You can interpret this a couple of different ways. One, obviously the change management skills are really important. You might also interpret that complex data analysis tools, you might conclude they're not important, or you might conclude that they're just not used as frequently, or that there are ways to handle those tasks more reliably, that there's less, that's the kind of thing that an expert can help you with, whereas skill at implementing change is, oftentimes something that the team leaders has to deal with more immediately. So now let's turn to the results of the second survey. We asked the question, all right, how effective is your blended learning model compared to whatever it is that you were doing before? And realizing there's a lot of variety in that, whatever you were doing before, and probably some squishiness in the measures of effectiveness. But this is a pretty encouraging result as well. We would have expected, based on pretty comprehensive academic research that was done 10 years ago, that the premium from blended learning would be somewhere in the 20% range. And there's a big meta-analysis that was done, a cross-sectional study that was funded by the Department of Defense, that predicted about a 20% premium in procedural knowledge. Okay, so building capability to know not just facts, but how to do something procedural. And that had been borne out, I think, about 10 years ago. We had a client that did a similar study that came up with almost the same results. And so we would have predicted about 20%. We're actually seeing, a median improvement of 30%, mean of 39.5%, pretty significant. And if you look at the distribution of those results, there was a lot of variation in the results. Some of our larger clients stating that their blended model was as much as twice as effective as what they were doing before. And just to get a kind of a perspective on, what that's really worth. If you go back to that first chart that I showed, okay, effectiveness was the biggest driver in training model design. Well, and I think probably you all know this, that if you're doing some number of projects a year, let's say it's 100 projects a year, and let's say they're only $50,000 a project, so $5 million a year. Well, if you get a 30% effectiveness improvement, which was the median value in the survey, by either getting more projects done or getting them done faster, then 30% of $5 million is a big number. And those numbers are pretty conservative for a large enterprise, where the per project savings are probably well north of $50,000, and the number of projects done per year would be well north of 100. So let's think now about what are these design elements that really, that lead to this effect? What's really driving effectiveness? So there are things out there that don't require much design thought, like making a smoothie. Basically, you can take some elements, just grab whatever fruit you have, throw it in a smoothie maker, and it's going to be pretty good, right? I mean, you don't have to put a lot of thought into that. The ingredients are really the whole key, and there's not much of a process to it. We've seen some people approach blended learning design in somewhat of a similar fashion. Not that can't work to some extent, but a very simplistic approach would be to just take a little e-learning and take a little classroom training and combine them together in whatever element, in whatever proportions you can afford, and march on down the road. But getting to a more, let's just say, a more refined product requires a little bit more design thinking. And it's not just the ingredients, okay? So it's also the rest. So if you think about a recipe, you typically list out the ingredients, but it's beyond ingredients, it's also the method. And that's what we want to get to, is understanding both the ingredients, the components that are used in a effective blended learning design, but also what are all the things that you do around the ingredients. So, what are the process steps? What are the sequence of things that I do? The timing, the proportions, the amounts, the treatment of how those elements are combined, and with a thought to the environment. So if it were food, then you'd be thinking about, well, what's the appetite of the people that I'm serving? What do they like to eat? How hungry are they? And so on and so forth. So if we kind of convert that thinking to a blended learning design, you could think of the requirements as being sort of voice of the business and voice of the student. The voice of the business is going to dictate, what kind of budget do I have? What are my constraints in terms of time? What are my constraints in terms of travel expense, or ability to travel? Can I get people together in one physical location? And if so, how often can I do it? What voice of the student considerations are, what's the technical background of the people that I'm training? Do we have a culture of process improvement where people are already well versed in some of the basics, or is this completely new to them? Am I training engineers? Is this an engineering company, or am I training people who have virtually no exposure to any of these technical tools? So those requirements really factor into what ingredients would we use, what are the process steps that are going to be appropriate, the sequence, the timing of the various learning activities, understanding the environment, the culture. When I worked at Ford, I worked in a plant for a long time, and there was a culture there that, I'll tell you frankly, didn't support learning. I mean, you'd be really in trouble if you got caught in the office. The plant manager used to walk through the office and say, "What are you doing in here? There's no assembly line running through this office." In some respects that was appropriate for that business in some respects, but it wasn't exactly a culture that fostered taking any time to learn anything new unless it was after hours. So those kinds of local, and they can be very local, cultural considerations also factor into the model design. All right, so let's look at some survey results, some of the feedback from the larger enterprise clients who are using a blended model. We asked them what were the components of their blend. So what are the various learning activities? What are the things that you're doing that are part of your model? And it's kind of interesting to see this distribution. Basically, they're doing a lot of things. So the model includes lots of components, from project work, actual project work, which I think we'd all accept is really important because that's why we do this in the first place. One-on-one coaching, study halls. A study hall in our vernacular would be a scheduled group activity, a review activity that might be typically layered in on top of e-learning. So structured, periodic, and they might be virtual or they might be in person gatherings to review content, ask questions, and make sure that people are staying on track. Online simulations, in our case, those are what I'd call high fidelity, somewhat realistic and complex simulations, DMAIC project simulations, or lean office Kaizen simulations. Physical sims that you may be familiar with, such as the ubiquitous Catapult for teaching design experiments and other tools, Sigma Station or Courier, which are paper-based kind of lean work role simulations. You've probably seen things perhaps with Lego or the stickle brick simulation that are more manufacturing oriented. So those are things that you do that are where there are physical objects that you're manipulating, and then classroom lecture. And there were some other, certainly some other components that are not listed here, like just having outside reading, for example. All right, so then we thought it might be useful to look at what's the difference between, if we look at our respondents and we stratify them and we look at those who have the most significant improvement versus those that have less significant improvement. So they still might be, and less significant might be 25% better. Okay, so the most significant were, I think the cutoff was like 65 or 70% better than what they were doing before. You know, and in some respects it may be a commentary on what they're doing before, but generally we wanted to look at what's different about those that are getting better results. And so the first thing that jumps out at you, if you look at the blue bar versus the gold bars, is the blue bar representing those with the highest improvement, is the first thing that jumps out is that they're doing more of everything. They have a much more saturated model, if you will. Their model is more complex in that there are more components that they're employing. And those with the lower levels of improvement have a less saturated model. They're doing a little less of everything. And in particular, the one thing that really stands out is use of simulations. So those that, if I go back, you'll see that use of online sims was maybe just slightly over half of the respondents. So out of the 29 respondents, 15 of them are using online simulations. But when you break down between effectiveness, you see that the companies that are using those simulations are predominantly are getting better results. So that's kind of interesting. Not surprising, but encouraging. So then we asked the question of the group that had the greatest improvement, which was, what was it, 8 companies. What are the success factors? What's really driving your success, do you think? And it's interesting to look at the responses because, structured timelines and deadlines. Okay, they're using realistic simulations. They have scheduled weekly or monthly meetings. They're using reporting and following up on the students that are going through the training. And they have good leadership support. And most of these things, with the exception of realistic simulation practice, have nothing to do with the actual learning. They're all infrastructure, they're management practice, the policies, procedures, approaches, they're the things that they're doing organizationally around the learning, not as much the learning itself. So to me, that's pretty interesting. And I think those of you that have been involved in this business for a while or this activity would probably echo that all of those things really matter, regardless of what learning activities you engage in. So then we asked the other group a little different question. If you had a do-over on your blended learning design, what would you do differently? And the biggest response was we'd use more simulation, which was also, it's encouraging that they recognized that, if I go back a couple slides, they recognized that this difference matters, that perhaps they would be getting better results if their mix of activities was different. So that really stands out, and I want to kind of delve into that a little bit, talk about simulation to perhaps help you think about how you might approach incorporating more simulation into your learning model. So I like to use this metaphor of football. By the way, that's a picture of Will Fuller running away from a USC defensive back. So a typical college football team plays something like 12 games, maybe 13. Games are 60 minutes, so that's 12 hours, but really it's less than that because any individual player is playing, offense or defense. It's really only 6 hours, and it's actually a lot less than that because of all the time spent in the huddle and so forth. So if you look at how much time they practice, I just figured this out. This is kind of my back of the envelope calculation, but it was something like 380 hours during the season. And therefore, the ratio of practice to play is something like 63-1. And I would predict that if you look at your ratio of practice to play, it's not even close to that. It's probably more like 1-to-1. It's more like you're going to spend about as much time training people as they're going to spend on their first project, maybe less. So we really have this expectation that it's like, it'd be like I'm going to go out and take one tennis lesson and then be able to play in a match at a high level, or one golf lesson, go to the range, hit a few, buckets of balls, and all of a sudden I'm going to be able to perform at a high level. So I think it might cause us to think about how we're really approaching the way we build capability. And if you go back to that effectiveness discussion we had about the value of effectiveness, wouldn't it be worth spending a little more time to practice more in order to perform better? We still have this idea that we can spend a little time in ground school looking at slides and listening to an instructor and somehow be able to deal with the dynamic challenges of the real world where there are things thrown at us that do not quite fit the template. I love this story of the guy a few years back, the pilot who was able to land a plane on the Hudson River. Certainly he'd never practiced landing a plane on the Hudson River, but he had spent a whole lot of time in a flight simulator. So the flight simulator, analogy is really appropriate, thinking about ground school, flight simulator, practice with an instructor before turning a pilot loose on a real airplane. Or, another way to think of it is just the batting cage analogy, spending that time in the batting cage where you can try things and you can fail and you can learn from that in a non-threatening environment where there's nothing on the line, so that when you get in the game and there is something on the line, and there's a lot on the line when we put our people into a project lead kind of role. Let's think a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about how we might organize our practice activities and simulations. I think Bloom's taxonomy is a good way to start, and you're probably familiar with this, this hierarchy. At the bottom, there's remembering basic facts, right? But at the top is what we're really trying to get to. We want people to be able to analyze, evaluate, and create some new reality. So executing a project and getting something done and convincing people to do things they don't want to do is not a simple task. It's not about remembering facts or understanding relationships. It's about, analyzing, evaluating, and creating something from scratch. Rarely can you just understand something about a process and change a setting on a machine and create some new reality. It's just not, that simple. So we ought to think about learning activities and how they line up against the objective of moving up on this taxonomy. And so I've laid out here's kind of the elements of the taxonomy, and let's think about learning activities on a continuum from activities that are passive, that are structured, that are simple, that are very linear, that are close-ended. Close-ended being, a discrete set of possible choices, like a multiple choice question, to active learning activities that are dynamic and complex and open-ended, which is much more reflective of the real world, where there is rarely a multiple choice. Multiple choice options are not usually presented to you when you're trying to execute a process improvement project of any complexity at all. So I think it's useful to map your learning activities, and so if we take this continuum of passive to active and simple to complex, and let's put this close-ended to open-ended on the y-axis and simple to complex on the x-axis, and you can kind of plot your learning activities. I've put a few down here just as a thought starter. Quizzes are typically close-ended, usually multiple choice. They could have, you could calculate a number that you input, so it could be more open-ended, but usually they're close-ended, and they can range from simple to a story problem, here's a story problem quiz with data, so they could be kind of complex. Drag and drop exercises, which we typically use in the e-learning, are a little bit more open-ended, but and maybe somewhat complex, but they're usually somewhere in the middle. There's the trusty catapult, which is fairly complex, although the factors are really predefined. You don't have to do too much investigation to understand what it is that you might change, and they're not completely open-ended. There are certain settings, that are predefined. So while it's sort of complex, it is not an open-ended, kind of problem. Dice and card drop kinds of exercises can be more open-ended, but they're pretty simple. They don't have what I call high fidelity. They don't relate directly to anything in the real world, unless perhaps you're running a casino. If we look up here on the closer to where project work is, project work is both open-ended and complex. There's a couple simulations, and these are the simulations that in that response from our client base that they're using as part of their blended model are lean process sims, like in our case it's called Inbox. In your world you may have experienced Inbox, you may have used paper-based simulation like Courier or MoveIt or Sigma Station. So they're great. They're open-ended in the sense that there's no multiple choice. It's all whatever the team dreams up, whatever changes they can imagine are the things that that they might pursue, but it's not particularly complex. There's not lots of data. Sigma Brew DMAIC would be simulation we use. It's more of a DMAIC project that's pretty exhaustive, sometimes exhausting, but you don't learn if you don't work. So Sigma Brew is much more complex in the sense that all the tools are tied together. It's more like a project. In the real world, one of the biggest problems that you've got to solve is, well, what do I do next? I mean, that's the common question. What do I do next? How do I frame the question I'm trying to answer next? What tool might I use to approach solving that problem? How do I translate the results or the output of that tool into some practical reality? And how do I make that happen? So if you're going to design practice exercises and simulations as learning activities, I'd encourage you to, kind of map it out and try to move the activities that you're using for learning towards a higher fidelity representation of the environment that your people are going to be working in. If you go back to the flight simulator example that I alluded to, when you get into a flight simulator, it's a direct representation of the instrument panel of the plane that you're learning to fly. It's not a flight simulator that has just a joystick and a couple of gauges. I mean, it is trying to be as high fidelity as possible so that you experience as much as possible what the real world is going to present. I mentioned tennis lessons. It's I guess the parallel would be if you're taking a tennis lesson and you have a pro feeding you balls and he's feeding them in the same location, the same pace every time, so that you have kind of time to set up and what's coming and it's predictable. That doesn't really represent the real world of playing in a game where your opponent is not probably going to be inclined to hit a shot in the same location at the same pace every time, so that you can be well prepared to hit it back. So in summary, what did we learn about the key ingredients? Well, realistic simulation matters a lot, and having a richer blend with more components matters a lot. If we look at what some of the key methods are, that's clear expectations, communicating clear expectations, having a structure to the learning with follow-up and appropriate leadership support to provide people the time to actually engage in learning, so that that it's not an onerous, it's not a penalty. That's something that they have to kind of jam in on their own time, but that they're actually given and it's not just support of the students, it's support of the model, support of the people that are designing the model, so that they can spend the time and resources necessary to provide the practice that's necessary to really be able to perform. So that closes my formal remarks, and we would be happy to entertain any questions that you have. We could talk a lot longer about blended learning. We could get into a lot of design elements, but we'll save that for a future webinar. So please, any questions that you have, fire them at us.
Okay, thanks. Let's start working through the list. And if you haven't already submitted a question, please type your question in the block on the attendee control panel. Bill, the first question that was submitted goes back to the More STEAM Clients Survey. And you asked respondents, how effective is your blended training model compared to the training model you used previously? Can you talk a little more about how the training effectiveness was measured?
Yeah, that's a good question. It was a whole mishmash of things. So you would think in this business that because Lean Six Sigma is all about measuring and building predictive models, that everyone who has a Lean Six Sigma program would be doing a great job of measuring their effectiveness, but that's not the case. And it's partly that's because of the time lags involved between training and what really matters is, are people getting projects done? Well, measuring that takes a long time. There are time lags, and there are a lot of confounding variables. The environment changes, the nature of the projects change. As you're doing more and more projects over time, sometimes there are less easy. There's less money laying on the floor that you can just pick up. So it's a mishmash of perception and various metrics. It is certainly driven by the project execution realities, but how that is, there was no common way that the respondents measured their results. So our feeling was, well, we know that it's going to be messy because they may not all be doing a great job of measuring effectiveness, but collectively, if we can get enough of them to respond, we're going to get some useful information out of that.
Okay, thank you. Now we have a question about learning styles. So when we think about blended learning and combining all those components that you mentioned, do you recommend an evaluation method for determining which type of people, for example, visual learners versus tactile learners, and consider that in how you design your blended training model?
I think our general approach, I have a couple comments on this. Our general approach is to have enough variety that people can gravitate to what works for them. Okay, so there are a lot of people that would prefer, I'll go back to my time at Ford. I mean, I would have gone anywhere to learn anything to get out of that plant for a week. So I would have gone to learn cross-stitching if I could have gotten out of that plant for a week. So it's difficult when you talk about learning styles. Sometimes it's really hard to sort out what's a real preference from what is a environmental kind of preference. Do I just want to go to training because it's easier for me to sit in a class and listen to an instructor and not really have to pay too much attention and kind of get a break from work and talk to people and have a donut and whatnot, is that face-to-face style really matter to me? I've seen some research that indicates that learning styles is really isn't real. It's a perception, but it's not really so strong as people think it is. I don't know. I mean, I hear it all the time, and people certainly believe that they have a preference. So the only way to keep this from being excruciatingly complex, I think, is to have a landscape of learning activities that allow people to gravitate to what's really working for them. And I think that's probably, if I go back to that model of kind of the saturation of learning, I think perhaps that's some of what's behind the higher success reported by firms that have a more saturated model. They have more activities. So I think you could assume that allows people to gravitate towards the activities that work for them.
Okay. Continuing along that path, we had another question that came in, and this one deals with more of a generational issue and learning needs and styles. So during the research that More Steam has done, in addition to any other outside reading, that you've encountered. Did you find any learning needs differentiation by group? Baby boomers versus millennials. Um, find anything on that?
It wasn't part of this study, but we've certainly had a lot of feedback around that. We have, as we've looked at how we evolved the design of our e-learning, for example, we're recognizing that there's a certain millennial kind of linked trait of not wanting to read anything that's too complicated, smaller, just a attention span problem to some extent. So it kind of drives us to try to be a little more visual, probably more interactive elements, less. So we have always had these design trade-offs, right, where some portion of the population would like to have less text, but the desire for less text does not always comport with. There doesn't mean there's somehow a reality that less complexity or less rigor is actually required to get a project done. So just because I want it to be simpler doesn't mean it is simpler. So we've got and we have a lot of our population would say, well, I want to be able to print out all this stuff. So we have to balance this very strong demonstrated desire over time to have all of the content available in text and available in text for those that might have a hearing problem, with a competing desire to have it be simpler and to have it be more visual. And so it's an interesting design trade-off that leads us to have multiple pathways, provide more flexibility to students or learners to be able to control their own path through the learning. It's interesting. It's fun to try to balance those things. Fun, and it's also difficult to try to balance those competing objectives.
Okay. We have a couple questions in regards to the components of blended learning. So I wondered if you could first talk a little bit more about the sims. For example, on one of your charts, you were showing the example of physical simulations that obviously people would have to complete in a classroom type setting, as well as online simulations. So those online simulations seem to have some potential for being used in a virtual environment. Are there any examples that you're familiar with that you can share with the audience?
Well, the first distinction I should make is most of the physical sims. Well, if I look at the catapult, for example, so catapult's great for teaching certain things. It's not, unless you're in the business of making catapults or some mechanical object, it doesn't really relate very directly to a process. I mean, most of the time, this work of Lean Six Sigma is being done on a process rather than on a mechanical object. And so it's hard for people to translate, how does this catapult relate to my world in healthcare? How does this learning to do a DOE on a catapult, how do I translate that to trying to improve the flow through my pediatric clinic? And so the physical simulations, with the exception of the lean simulations that I mentioned, which are a little more comprehensive, more of a work role simulation, they tend to be more of a piece, teaching a particular tool rather than teaching a collection of tools. And what we would say that's really important is teaching critical thinking. The glue that holds all the tools together is critical thinking, and that's what's harder to teach. The physical the lean office kinds of sims are good for that because they introduce a lot of ambiguity, and the opportunity for role play. We think role play is really important as part of any simulation. Within our online sims, there are sort of scripted programmed components to the sim, but they create that story, and that situation creates the context to be able to add on unscripted activities that are perhaps not scored as part of simulation, but are really useful. So whether that's working through some change management or team leadership, or how do I approach, Ellen says she can't come to my team meetings anymore because she's got some conflicting work demands. What am I going to do? Well, how do I deal with that? Or somebody wants to really push the scope of this project wider because they have another personal objectives or political objective outside of what the project really should be about. How do I deal with that? So those kind of role-playing activities are useful. That, I guess what I'm getting to is some of those things are best done in a classroom and are really hard to do online. Now, and there's a certain energy when you can get people together in a physical space working on a simulation, and I think my experience has been it's really useful for learning, not just the learning critical thinking, but building a network. So if you think of team leaders as kind of network hubs, their effectiveness is a function of how many connections they have to other people, other team leaders, other people involved in this activity. So part of building capability is not just teaching Bill how to think critically and employ certain tools, but it's also how does Bill build a network so that he has people he can reach out to for help when he needs help. And so we have, this is a long answer, but we have some clients who are very constrained in terms of travel, and who have done some really interesting things to run simulations in a virtual environment, and to use screen sharing and use collaborative online tools, because that's how they do their work. And so if we get back to that notion of high fidelity simulation, well, if the work I'm doing is virtual and I have to work with global teams and learn how to function in that environment, then perhaps I ought to be playing the simulation in a virtual kind of environment, because that's the way I'm going to be doing the work. So that's a long rambling answer to the question, but I hope it was somewhat useful.
Well, I'm going to ask you actually to ramble a little bit more, but let me help you in terms of directing the attention, continuing along the path. So you talk again about these components and the e-learning and study halls and coaching and the simulations. So thinking back to your slide with the smoothie, that it doesn't work just to throw it all together. There has to be some very thoughtful sequencing of the activities and how they all relate to each other. Is there any type of general model that you can put up there, and how, if someone was just getting started, so is there a template that you can offer to say, start with this?
Yeah, I think I don't have it handy, but we're happy to share that with you. Kind of the tried and true starting point that and I can explain in a nutshell what it is. It is e-learning that covers most of the content, most or all of the content, with a lot of practice. So ideally, you want the e-learning, you'd like half the time spent in the e-learning to be doing something at least. Because you can't learn this stuff just by watching it. I mean, you have to do it. Overlaying that, the next thing that's really important is a structure to keep people on track. So that means, I'll call it study halls. So it is a periodic group event that is scheduled, let's say, after define. We're going to have a 2-hour study hall. After measure, maybe another, depending on what my resources allow, I may be doing a couple of those in measure. I may have a couple study halls in analyze because it's more complicated. At least one in improve, and then in control. So I'm going to have a schedule laid out so that when Ellen starts this course, first of all, she knows, here's when you need to be done, here's your touch points along the way, here's the study halls that we're going to have that you're going to have to participate in, and we're going to review some extra some extra material. We're going to do a little more practice. We're going to handle any questions that you have and make sure that you're staying on track. So we use that as a ratcheting function. So we don't get to the end of the schedule and find out that Bill has never even opened up his e-learning. Just like any good process control, we want to be able to react early when we see a drift. We don't want to find out at the end that we've shipped bad product and got the customer upset. We want to know internally as soon as things start to get off track. We would like that study hall to be informed by the performance of the cohort of the wave. So ideally, the instructor would not just, so back to this ingredients versus, the smoothie versus having design. Well, the smoothie approach would be to say, oh, we're going to have these study halls, and it's going to be kind of ad hoc. The design approach would be to say, well, let's look at the performance of the people in the cohort. Let's look at their quiz scores. Let's try to understand what they're struggling with. And then let's tailor our study hall materials to perhaps what the data would tell us. Let's use analytics to know what we should be covering, and also introduce any company or organizational specific little nuances, that's where you can kind of introduce some customization. Then the next component, I skip project work. I'm just assuming, but I shouldn't, that the participants should have some project identified before they start training. Okay, the training should be a pull. It should not be a push. So in our perfect world, you start with, what's the organization trying to achieve? What are the gaps between our imperatives and where we are? What projects do we need to do to close those gaps? Do we have somebody that's capable of leading that project work? If we don't, well, let's develop that capability so we're training people to do the projects that we've identified, rather than just training people and saying, okay, now go find a project. I think it's been pretty well proven that doesn't work very well. So then the next component is simulation that is kind of addressed in 3 places, right? So simulation within the e-learning, sort of tool-specific simulations, okay? Then perhaps simulation within the study hall that's instructor-led. So instructors might be using some gadgets to do simulate processes or simulate tools. And then the last thing is a capstone. So we really think it's useful to have a simulated project experience so that when the belts are graduated, if you will, they leave the training feeling like, okay, I've got a real project I've started working on. Maybe I'm kind of floundering around a little bit because it's my training project. But I've done something that feels like a project as I've gone through training. I've used, I've done enough simulations to understand the tools, but I've also done some simulation that represents the glue, the space between the notes, if you think of it in musical terms, the glue between the tools. So that kind of capstone event where you put it all together is really important. And that would be, in our case, Sigma Brew DMAIC or the newer, shorter Sherlock Holmes Zombie Hunter.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Hey, Bill, we are 5 minutes before the hour, and I have 2 more questions that if you're willing to do kind of a fast round wrap up to fit both of the questions in. Would that be all right?
Yeah, that's fine. And let me just add that we'll answer any of your questions. And I'm happy to talk to anybody about this. I can talk about this all day. So if we don't handle your question or you got something you just want to talk about, I don't want this to be a sales pitch. I want to really talk about blended learning and simulation. I talk more about our products because that's what I'm familiar with. But I think these lessons can be applied, generically. But go ahead, Ellen.
Okay. First question. We've talked a lot about the training aspect and how to design the training program. So now let's just summarize on the retention side. Do you have any comments, any thoughts in how to gauge knowledge retention over a period of time?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would say, one of the biggest challenges I didn't get into in this presentation is getting people to continue to use these tools, right? So training green belts and getting them woven into the ongoing process of working on projects rather than just doing one project because it was part of my training. That's a big problem across our client base, okay? And so knowledge retention to me is a function of practice. If you're using things, it's like any skill, right? If I play golf, I don't really. I have a little bit, but I haven't played much in years. And however good I was before, I'm a lot worse now because I don't practice. So I think it's all about practice, and it's all about having an expectation that project work is a condition of employment, that it's a condition of survival for the organization, not something that we just do because it was part of training. That's a short answer. We could talk, for hours about that subject and that problem.
Right. Okay, concluding question. Would you comment just briefly in regards to the evolution of blended learning, and in particular, how you see it evolving in higher ed?
So if I go back 15 years ago, e-learning was pre-work. It was basically, you can read this stuff online, and then we're going to use the same lecture-based, classroom-based lecture model that we used before. We're just going to do less of it. So that was what I'd call first generation blended learning, was just offloading some of the lecture to an online activity. If I compare that to where we are today, we have online learning that's very interactive, that includes oftentimes much more practice than you would get in a classroom environment. Okay, so if you compare the typical kind of lecture-based training used in this field, and if typical exists, but there is typically lots of talking and not much doing. Okay, so e-learning now that has evolved to offering a lot more practice, a lot more depth of content, a lot more different pathways and alternate kind of learning activities. So that's been really the biggest evolution, a lot more tailoring to the specific functional area, or customization for a particular business environment, but also functional customization, and so much more tailoring to the environment of the, you didn't used to, 15 years ago, you couldn't get Lean Six Sigma training customized for healthcare, for example. You'd have to try to figure out, how do I translate these manufacturing examples to the operating room? And that's a big problem. But that's been probably one of the biggest points of evolution. I think there's also a resurgence in the valuing of coaching. I think people are coming back around to recognizing that solid coaching at the point of use and at the point of need is really, really valuable in helping to get projects across the goal line. And so that's been a definite trend, along with the incorporation of more and more simulations into the learning model. So those are the big drivers. And in higher ed, it's really no different than in the business world, other than the expectations are a little different because the population is younger. okay, and has, it's a YouTube generation. And so there are a little different expectations with regard to production values and so forth.
Okay. And as you said, we got through the audience's questions. I think we may have had one or two questions that we don't have time for, but we'd love to follow up with you with those questions and any others that you have on your mind. We'll be showing contact information on our very last slide. So thank you, Bill, for your presentation today. I'd like to close the program with just a quick mention of some professional development opportunities offered by More STEAM. For those of you who are certified black belts already and are interested in taking your career to the next step, More STEAM in partnership with Ohio State, and you can see a picture of our website right on your screen and one of our MBB instructors shown there. We offer a Master Black Belt certification program in a blended learning format. So the program combines online course modules with 2 weeks of classroom sessions at Ohio State. For those of you who are not already certified black belts, we offer a new program, a blended black belt training and certification program. You'll find information on our website about that, along with the additional belt courses, training, certification at the green belt and black belt levels, which can be completed 100% online. So please visit our website, not only for our product offerings, but also we have a ton of free resources available. We have tool tutorials, we have white papers, articles, and a variety of on-demand webcasts such as this. So please find us on the web. Thank you for spending the past hour with us. As I mentioned before and Bill mentioned, please contact us if you have additional questions or just want to follow up with some conversation. The slides from today's program, along with a recording, and we also have a white paper that is available on our website that I'll give you the link to in a follow-up email. So watch your inbox for the email with a link to the specific pages on our website. I'll send that email out as soon as they're available. I'll also be sending out a notice about the February webcast. We're going to be focusing more on Lean Six Sigma leadership, and that email will be sent out next week. Thank you so much for sharing part of your day with us, and we hope to see you next month.
Thank you.